Hi, everyone. Thank you for that intro, Beth. Oh, okay. Yeah, so I will be talking to you today about React hooks and looking at the old and the new. Before we get into it, a little bit about me. So I work at Spotify as a software engineer. I've been there for about a year and a half now, and basically work very much behind the scenes. So if you know the Spotify product, I have nothing to do with the actual app. And I work on with a team that manages backend services that allow internal teams to access user account data. Outside of work, I like reading. That's the last book I read, would recommend. I also enjoy any food-related activities, so whether that's eating, cooking, whatever it is, I love food. Traveling, and also aspiring tennis pro. And then I also love just being outdoors and in nature in general. So on to the talk itself. Today, I'm going to start off talking about why hooks exist in React, and then looking at some of the most common hooks that we use. I'll also briefly talk about custom hooks, and then finally, the new and shiny stuff, React 19, and what they've recently introduced in terms of hooks. And then I'll close off with some comparisons and conclusions between the old and the new. So let's get into it. So if you've used React before, you will know what this means, class versus functional. And I can't explain why hooks exist without looking at the comparison between these two. So when React was first introduced, they started off with class components, which were basically very chunky components that relied on JavaScript's ES6 class. They had their own internal states, and they also had lifecycle methods, like component did mount, component did update. And then React decided, let's introduce functional components. And these were basically just plain old JavaScript functions. They didn't have their own state, and they were a lot easier to write. And essentially, the creators of React decided that they needed a way for functional components to be able to access React's features like React states, React lifecycle methods, and we'll look at a few of those lifecycle methods in a second. And that is when hooks were introduced. So a hook is basically just a function, a JavaScript function that allows us to access React state and React lifecycle methods. So when a component is rendered on the page, how do we access data, how do we fetch data, and things like that. And yeah, just a little bit about why hooks are amazing. Firstly, yeah, we don't really need class components anymore because hooks help us with hooks, we just need to write functional components and we can access state. And then also better performance. So there are multiple hooks that are used to memoize, which is just like cache data and make your React application faster. We can also create reusable hooks, which are custom hooks that essentially have one specific purpose. And then it also makes it a lot easier to test and organize your code. So this is a quick comparison between class and functional. As you can see on the left, the left is significantly longer than the right. The left is a class component, which still exist in React, but aren't necessarily required. And then we have the functional component on the right, which is a lot shorter and just easier to get your head around. So hooks. The very first hook is use effects. So again, if you've used React before, you've definitely used use effects, and it gives a lot of developers headaches because of what is called the dependency array. And that is basically, so if you have a web page and you want data to load as soon as you land on the page, you would use use effects. And that allows you to fetch data. And it also is great because it essentially puts all of those React cycles into one. So this is a quick summary of what a component render cycle looks like. The component is first mounted, and then whenever any of its states or props change, it updates. And then finally, if you navigate away from a web page, for example, the component is unmounted. And so with use effects came the ability to be able to have all of those cycles within one single hook. And so you see there, it takes in a callback function, which is what is called as soon as your component is loaded. And then it has a cleanup function, which is the return function. And finally, whatever you put in your dependency array will update your function whenever its value changes. So that's a great benefit of this hook, except that it comes with just making sure that those dependencies are relevant, making sure that you put the right values in there so you don't lead to infinite loops, And also just like making sure that you use any conditional logic. So if this happens, then do this. Otherwise, you find that your component just ends up in an infinite loop. And then the next hooks we'll be looking at are pretty similar. Again, if you have a web page that has a lot of expensive functions, so say you're loading 100,000 values once you land on a page, you don't want to keep loading those values every time if they don't actually change. Otherwise, your component is just going to keep rendering, and this leads to performance issues. And this is where these two lovely hooks come in. So this is a quick example of useMemo. useMemo essentially caches a value, and useCallback caches a function definition. So this is an example of a tweets value being wrapped in useMemo, and this value will only update and re-render a component when the fetch recent tweets function returns a different value. And then useCallback, again, this is great for function definitions. So if you think about a React component, anytime anything changes, it's going to re-render, and that means essentially reload. And so if that function isn't wrapped in useCallback, then every single time the count value changes, the child component as well as the parent component will re-render. But useCallback helps us to basically only re-render the parent component without affecting the child. And so it's a great way to basically cache data and also just avoid unnecessary unnecessary performance issues in your code base. This also comes with a few problems, like making sure that you don't overuse it. I've seen components that have so many of these hooks. And I think because of what they do, there's a tendency to try and over-optimize and wrap every single function in your code inside a useCallback or a useMemo. So it's one of those things that you have to kind of watch out for. They could also have a counter effect. So if you put a particularly large function or value inside one of these hooks, then you actually find that you're increasing memory over time because you're keeping a large value stored in memory. And again, that leads to performance issues. The final hook I'll look at, the final older hook, it's not quite old, but is useContext. And this essentially helps you to pass values across many different components. So if you think about a React application, it could have 100 components. And if you want one single value to be available to all those components, the alternative to this hook is to pass that down through all the props, from the parent to the parent to the parent to the child to the child to the child. And that means that those will re-render every single, if a parent state changes, then the child will re-render, and it's called prop drilling, and it just makes it could make your application significantly slower than you need it to be. So useContext allows you to pass in a single value across multiple components, and it's particularly useful with like applications that have a complex component hierarchy. And this is an example of how it's used. So inside the child, you're passing in a title or assigning a title to a useContext from a parent, and it's as simple as this. Funny enough, React has introduced, this is a little redundant because React has just introduced a new feature called the React compiler, which completely replaces these two hooks. But yeah. And then custom hooks quickly. So these allow you to basically create specific functionality or specific functions for specific purposes within your app. So if you want to share complex logic across your application, or if you have a third-party library that you're integrating with, and you want to avoid, say, new developers having to understand how those libraries work, you would just abstract that logic away inside a custom hook, and nobody needs to know how the third-party library is working. And then finally, these are great for testing. So this is a quick example of a use toggle hook. I've said the word use many, many times already. So this basically returns a method called toggle, and then is toggled, which is a true or false value, and you use this for like a form, for example, in your application. All right, so now the fun stuff. React 19 was recently introduced, or recently released a few new hooks back in February. Use optimistic is the first one. The second one, use, is a very interesting name choice. And then use form status and use form state. So I will be doing a quick demo of these 4 hooks. But firstly, just to get into how they work. So use optimistic. If you use like Instagram and Twitter, I'm sure we all use Instagram and Twitter here, but if you do, if you like a picture on Instagram, you notice that you get the red heart immediately. And that is basically what you would call an optimistic update. So this is returning a response, like a success response to the user as soon as there's an interaction, in the hopes that the server will respond with a success. So if you need to update your, say, a form or anything on your UI and you want the user to get immediate feedback, you could use this hook potentially. Kind of going to go through these. And then use, this replaces a few hooks that we've recently looked at. So this is a great hook because it actually has 3 functionalities in one hook. So if you think of promises in React and context in React, it basically replaces the use context hook that we just looked at, and it also allows you to pass in promises. So essentially what this hook does is it returns a value from anything that needs to be, a resource that needs to be resolved. So if you think a promise needs to return a value, context needs to return a value, you could use this hook. So this is it being used for the purpose of the context. Again, we saw use context hook, and this replaces that completely. And then use promise, again, it's just an equivalent of having const data, then assigning it to a promise and awaiting that promise. And then the great thing about this hook as well is that you can use it inside conditionals and loops, which is one of the rules, which is an existing rule of hooks in React, where you have to use them at the top level of your component. And then finally, the last 2 are basically help you to handle like native form control, so validating forms and accessing the state of forms. And yeah, that is what this doesn't take in any parameters, and it returns pending, method, data, and action. And yeah, when I do the demo, yeah, so this is a quick look at how it works. You can see that the pending value there is being used to disable the button when the form is submitted. So it's nice to have that control over your forms. And then finally, this one, which took me a long time to wrap my head around. This, again, just helps you manage the state of your form. So you can access state that has just been submitted. So if I click submit on a form, I can access that state, and it also returns a new action to me that I can then decide that I pass into the form. But yeah, when I do the demo, this will all make sense. Again, this is how this works. And then I'm just going to connect that. Please work. Okay, so the very first hook, use optimistic. So again, this is a very bad version of Twitter, but say I have a list of tweets here, and then I have a quick, an input form with a post button. So on the left, if you can see the code clearly, I just have a deliver, oh no. This is going to be very tough. Okay, I'll try not to move the laptop. Yeah, so deliver tweets is just an async function. It's basically mocking an API call, and it's returning a promise and resolving after 2 seconds. And then I have my hook right here, use optimistic, which takes in my current state, and then also, again, an update function. And the update function takes in current state again, and also my new value. And what it does is basically merges those 2 values together. So I'm going to, what should I say? Thank you. Twinkle, twinkle. And then I post, and you see that updates the UI immediately, even though the promise is actually returning or resolving after 2 seconds. So that's essentially how it works. And then you can also make this a little more flexible and what I've done here is just I'm controlling the color of the text with the posting status of true or false. So if I say little star, and I post that, you see the text is gray for a second, which kind of represents what's an API call, like what the loading state of an API call, and then once that's done, it posts. And then if the promise or API was to fail, then I would reject that. So I've set this to reject, and then what will happen is I'll tweet, and then it will basically be removed from the form once it's rejected. So twinkle, twinkle, little star. How I wonder what you are. So post, that happens for a few seconds, and then you see that it's gone. So that is great for basically enhancing your user experience and like basically just making for a faster and more responsive application. And then on to the next hook, the fun one, use. So I'm only demonstrating it with a promise, not the context. So here we have what we would typically have in an application, in a React component. So we have loading states, which is currently set to false. Then we have a state message, which is empty. And then in my use effect, I'm making an API call, fetch message, which is also down here just as a set timeout. And then finally setting that loading state to false once I'm done. And then here I'm just returning downloading message once the page is loading, and then once that has returned a message to me, I display the message. So this is how we would currently do things now. With the use hook, I can essentially get rid of all of this code. And, no, not yet. Get rid of that too. And almost done. Okay, this was not meant to happen. Okay. Oh, thank you very much. Okay, perfect. So as we can see, oh no, that's not working. Oh, sorry, I have it in the wrong place, my bad. Okay. Yeah, these are small caveats with these new hooks. Okay, so yeah, we can see that it does the exact same thing. So it sets downloading message and then returns the message as good evening. And essentially what is happening is this line here takes in a promise, fetch message, and once that promise resolves, it's the value that it returns is assigned to message. And it essentially combines the use effect hook, the use effect hook and like a data fetching API or fetch API into one hook. And it also replaces use context. So it has many, many benefits, and it helps to reduce your code base significantly, which is always a plus. The caveat here is that you have to kind of wrap this in a suspense to capture that loading states. And if you would have an error, you could use an error boundary in React to catch those errors. Okay. Use form status. Again, we saw pending showing on the slide earlier. So I have a simple form here, and I'm just capturing this pending value from the hook, which takes in no parameters. And then I'm disabling the button based on this. I'm also controlling it using pending. So submitting changes to submitting when it's pending, and then submit when it's done, which we already kind of do. So Dara. And then I can also access the states as I'm submitting as well, using the data property that's returned. So this returns a status object, and yeah, that is essentially what it does. Again, there are many libraries that kind of already do the same thing, but React is trying to be better. So, and then finally, use form state. This is quite nice because it allows you to access like form state before you have done anything. So essentially, it takes in an action, and these actions are another new feature in React, which basically I kind of replaced the onSubmit method that we have on forms. And so my form action is basically what my form does. So over here, again, just a form that returns success true and then success false. if the name is not Dara. And what that allows me to do is I also can access the form states over here on line 24. I can access form states and form success before I've actually submitted this form. So if I say the name is Dara, this just changes to yay. Because I've changed that using this success value from the form. So yeah, that is a quick demo of, okay, goes back in here. Oops. Okay. So yeah, that is how those new hooks work in React. So just to close off, looking at the old versus the new. Oops. Yeah, so I think just like a few of my thoughts, I think it's interesting that the use hook has like a 3-in-1 approach, solving 3 different problems. It also breaks one traditional rule of hooks, which is they must be at the top level of your component. And so that could potentially suggest having more flexibility with hooks in general over time. The new use form status and use form hooks, they are solving like a major pain point of developers, which is like handling and validating forms. Although there are like lots of existing libraries that already do similar things. So although we might rely less on these libraries, we might also just stick to them, because with those hooks, you kind of have to use them in tandem for it to work. So you kind of have to use optimistic, use form status, and use form states like all in one for it to really make sense within your application. And then also there are multiple caveats. So like with the use form, with the use form states hook, it has to be used within a form tag, which is fair, but it also has to be used, it can't be used, or it doesn't apply to forms that are within the same component. So you have to wrap the child components within a parent form, and it's just, all of those little bits and pieces here. So it's just, if you're refactoring an application to use these, you have to be extra careful. And yeah, the like React ecosystem is changing. Like I said earlier, the React compiler completely replaces use memo and use context and just caches and memoizes internally. So we might just need to use hooks less and less over time, which is counter to this whole talk, but yeah. And yeah, this is a tweet that kind of summarizes essentially what I've just shared, that there's just a lot of change happening at the moment within the React ecosystem, hooks being replaced by new hooks, but also hooks being replaced entirely. And yeah, it's exciting. So thank you.
I can't wait to use. So yeah, it must have been kind of a fun talk to prepare, especially with all these demos. Can we access those demos?
Yes, but they're in the experimental version, so you need to import like React experimental.
Right.
Yeah.
I see.
Use them at the moment. To use them at the moment. Yeah.
To use all of them. So which one was your favorite?
I think.
Why did they call it that?
I don't know. I think use resolved might have been a better name, but I think they called it use because it kind of solves multiple problems, so it's less limiting. And I think use was my favorite, just because of how much flexibility it has and how much it replaces. It's also great that you can use it. Gosh, this word. Within like conditionals and if statements, so you don't need to have it at the top level anymore. And then it also does the data fetching immediately. You load a component, so you don't need use effects anymore. So yeah.
Yeah, which I'm personally always happy to see the back of, but don't know about any of you. If it's possible to not use effects. Yeah, that was really amazing. Has anyone got questions? Come on. I'll let you think for a little bit longer. So one thing I was wondering whilst I was watching this was like, do you think that, do you think that the React team are developing for users or for developers more by making these hooks?
That's a really interesting question. I would say developers more, just because a lot of this, firstly, the benefits point to allowing us to like reduce our code base, increase performance, although there are hooks that already increase performance, but I think majority of the new ones, for example, use form states and use form status, an end user has like no idea what the benefits of those are. They just see a form. Of course, optimistic updates are good as well, but I think a lot of it is geared more towards increasing like developer workflow, developer experience, and coding speed in general.
Yeah, right. And maybe almost like trying to increase reliance on React instead of external libraries as well.
Exactly.
Kind of keeping people in the fold now.
Yeah, and I think they're probably gonna, I don't know if there will be a significant reduction in the use of external libraries, because like I said, these hooks are solving one thing here, one thing there, and like a library like React Hook Form does many different things for you. So I guess people will kind of transition to either one, but depending on personal preferences.
And like I suppose if you have like a greenfield project, that's going to be fine for it. But if you're like working on a massive monorepo that's really old, maybe don't refactor the whole thing. Yeah. So that was going to be my next question actually, was like, are you planning on using them anytime soon? Like which ones maybe have you already used, or which ones do you, well, obviously it's got the experimental flag, but which, like, do you plan to actually refactor anything, or do you want to like wait until you really need an optimistic update or something in order to get a better user experience?
Yeah, I think I've only played around with them. I haven't used them in any like real life production apps, but I think again, like I would probably most likely be using the use hook, because the other ones are very specific to, I guess, forms, whereas that one handles many different things, like specifically data fetching. I think it's great for just having a one-liner, even though you need your suspense and your error boundary. It just simplifies your code a lot. So that one.
Arguably, you should all have suspense and error boundaries wrapping your code anyway. But yeah, that's what the React team would probably tell you. And to some extent, it is true. Because I think we're used to trying to wait inside the component rather than wrapping the parent in the suspense. But actually, once you get used to that pattern, then you can kind of trust that you can at least partially load things. And yeah, I suppose the final thing that occurred to me is a lot of it seems to be geared up to like interleaving server-side rendering with asynchronous functionality, right? So like, if you have to wrap something in a suspense hook that has the use hook in it, then that can be loading whilst the rest of your potentially statically generated website can already be there. So do you think it's like they are building it with that in mind?
Yeah, I think so. I think specifically with like, I'm not sure which one it was, maybe use optimistic. And there's also like a use transition hook, which allows you to update your UI and have other things loading, and like without affecting your page performance or the actions that are happening in your page. So, I mean, I'm not sure specifically if that was their intention, but I think it does solve that problem. So
maybe we don't need Next anymore.
Good point.
No, controversial point. But given that they're already using React 19 actually under the hood, right? Yeah. I suppose, has anyone been inspired with a question? Yes. Great. We'll bring you a mic. If you say it, I'll repeat it so everyone online later can hear.
So you mentioned that you're not working that much on the like the part that we see of Spotify, the good part. So where would you use React in this case, like what you showed? Is there somewhere else that's applicable?
Yeah. So Spotify has a lot of internal teams, and they also have a lot of internal products. So one of the products that my team manages is a web app that allows other teams to create test Spotify accounts and use that for like QA, and like if there's a new feature that they've built, they want to create a test account to test that feature. So we have internal React apps where we would use all of these features.
I see, that's very interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, that's really cool. Ooh, more questions, yeah.
I just wanted to ask, what are some of your tips on keeping up to date with all of the new features in React? Aside from events like this, are there places to look, things to look out for, so we can keep in the loop?
Yeah, great question. I guess I would recommend the React docs. I guess Twitter as well, which is quite good for like tech updates, depending on if you're following the right pages and accounts. I didn't mean that, but yeah, Twitter is helpful, and the React documentation is great. I think they have a blog where they post these updates. But just generally, like front-end blogs, tons and tons of them have articles on all of these new React features already. I think also Reddit, surprisingly, has some good content as well. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a great one called, I think, is it React.js Weekly? Can someone correct me if I've said that wrong? And that one's really good as well. But also, yeah, the React blog itself, you know, like I think you can even subscribe to just the blog updates, and then that's their official release notes and stuff, right?
Exactly.
And they've put a really good summary of this exact stuff up there. We had one more question, at least. Has it now disappeared? Was there one more? Yes.
Hi, thank you. My question is rather, when would you use layout effect? I mean, you've mentioned use effect, and I've hardly see use layout effect. So when would you use it?
Yeah, great question. I haven't used it personally, but essentially it's like a different version of use effect, and allows you to render data before your browser like paints the page. So if you want to kind of like measure the height of the window, for example, you would put that inside use layout effect. So it actually renders before your use effect.
It's a dangerous one though, because it can block the rendering of your entire application if you're not careful. I've also barely used that one, so I'm glad you could just remember. I was going to ask you about use reducer briefly. Have you ever found a use case for that?
No, actually, not really. I guess it's good when you have like when you're managing complex state. But I think I just tend to stick to the ones I use most regularly are like use effect, use state.
Yeah, the classics,
Mm-hmm.
the golden oldies. Soon to be use. Maybe they'll all just fold into use one day. That's kind of be nice, wouldn't it?